Willow Creek flowed where no one remembered it anymore. Once its banks bustled with the sound of mills, the creak of wagon wheels carrying grain to the ferry crossing, and children splashing in shallow inlets, unafraid of its dark waters. Now the river was almost a legend, a narrow ribbon of water winding between overgrown willows and sedges, hidden from casual sight by a thick fog that rose from its surface even on the clearest days. Locals avoided it, preferring to reach neighboring towns by a new road that stretched a few miles north. The bridges over Willow Creek had long collapsed, and the old ferry which once connected the banks had vanished as suddenly as it appeared years ago. The story of this ferry was passed down by word of mouth in the town of Stonehaven, the closest settlement to the forgotten crossing. The elders spoke of a ferryman who appeared during the hardest times, during the war, when people had to flee advancing troops, abandoning their homes and taking only what was essential. Many then sought ways to cross the river to hide in the forests on the other side, and the ferryman helped them. A silent man in a dark cloak who transported people for a symbolic fee. No one remembered his face hidden by a deep hood, but everyone recalled his hands, pale as if carved from marble and astonishingly strong as he worked his pole, guiding the flat-bottomed boat through the slow waters of the river. Anna Miller, a 70-year-old retired teacher, was one of the few who still remembered those times. She had lived in Stonehaven her entire life, and her house stood quite close to the path leading to the old crossing. As a child, she often heard her mother whispering with neighbors about strange things happening by the river. They said the ferryman only worked after sunset, and that those who crossed with him in the dark never returned to their homes. At first, people thought the refugees had simply found new homes far away, but gradually oddities became noticeable. Relatives who should have sent word remained silent. Acquaintances who promised to return for left-behind belongings never showed up. And the ferryman continued his work, appearing every evening at the dock as if awaiting new passengers. Anna remembered the night her older sister, Sarah, decided to cross the river. Sarah was 5 years older, a beautiful girl with long, fair braids and laughing eyes. She had fallen in love with a soldier from a neighboring town who promised to wait for her on the other side. The war had ended, but the soldier didn't return. He stayed on that side of the river to help rebuild his uncle's ruined mill. Sarah couldn't wait any longer. She gathered her few belongings in a canvas bag and headed to the crossing, ignoring her mother's pleas to stay home until morning. Anna was just a child then, but she followed her sister, hiding in the thickets by the bank. The ferry appeared as soon as the sun dipped below the treetops. First, a fog, thicker and whiter than usual, emerged, and then a dark figure floated out of it on a long boat. The ferryman stood at the stern, leaning on his pole, his silhouette motionless as a statue. Sarah approached the water, and the ferryman silently extended a hand, helping her aboard. Anna remembered that moment for life, how her sister turned one last time, waved toward the bank, unaware she was being watched, and then sat on the bench in the middle of the boat. The ferry slowly pushed off from the bank, and the fog closed around it, swallowing the boat, the ferryman, and Sarah. No one ever saw her again. Years passed, and the story grew with new details. Some said the ferryman was the spirit of an ancient boatman who drowned in the river centuries ago and was now doomed to eternally serve as a guide between worlds. Others claimed he was the devil himself in human form, luring souls to the underworld. But most simply tried not to think about the river and what might happen on its dark waters after sunset. The path to the crossing gradually became overgrown with grass and bushes, the dock weathered and partially submerged, and the young people who grew up in peacetime considered the stories about the ferryman just tall tales told by elders to scare children. But the river remembered. Every evening as the sun set beyond the horizon, a fog rose above its surface, and something moved within that fog, slowly, inexorably, as if awaiting a new summons. And that summons was not long in coming. A new resident arrived in Stonehaven, Michael Davis, a 40-year-old engineer who bought an abandoned house on the outskirts of the town, deciding to start a new life away from the city bustle. He had recently divorced his wife, lost his job at a large company due to a conflict with his boss, and felt his life had reached a dead end. The village house came to him for a symbolic sum. The former owners had moved to the city, and no one wanted to buy an old dwelling in the middle of nowhere. The house stood just half a mile from the river, and from his very first days, Michael felt its presence. In the mornings, he saw a gray strip of fog rising above the trees, heard the barely discernible lapping of water and the whisper of reeds. He liked this feeling of closeness to nature. In the city, he was so tired of the noise of cars, factory sirens, and endless hurry that the silence of the village seemed a blessing. He spent the first weeks repairing the house, replacing the leaky roof, fixing the stove, tidying up the small garden. The work distracted him from heavy thoughts about his broken marriage and uncertain future. The neighbors were wary of him, but not hostile. Anna Miller, whose house was closest to his property, sometimes stopped by with pies or vegetables from her garden. She saw Michael struggling with loneliness, how he wandered around the house in the evenings not knowing how to occupy himself. The city man adapted poorly to the village rhythm of life. There were no entertainments. The internet was intermittent, and the only way to pass the time was long walks in the surroundings. And gradually these walks began to bring Michael closer and closer to the river. At first, he simply explored the area, trying to understand where his property boundaries lay, and which paths led to neighboring towns. He found an overgrown road that descended to the water, and an old, half-ruined dock protruding from the reeds. The place seemed beautiful and calming to him. The river was not wide, but deep, its dark water flowing slowly between moss-covered banks, and on the other side, thick forests stretched as far as the horizon. Michael began to come here every day, especially in the evening when work on the house was done and the village sank into sleepy silence. The water captivated him with its tranquility and a primal silence that had been missing from his former life. Michael would sit on the old dock planks, dangle his legs over the water, and gaze at the opposite bank for hours, pondering how his fate might have unfolded if he had made different choices. His divorce from Helen hadn't been due to infidelity or a major argument. They had simply become strangers living in the same apartment. She pursued a banking career. He designed industrial buildings, and somewhere between endless reports, meetings, and future plans, they lost each other. They had no children. First, they postponed it because of work, then money. Then they just stopped talking about it. And when Helen announced she wanted a divorce, Michael felt not pain, but a strange relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The job loss was a logical continuation of his collapsing personal life. The company's new director brought in his own people, and Michael, who had worked for the firm for 12 years, found himself redundant. The severance package allowed him to buy the village house and live comfortably for several months. But he didn't know what would happen next. At 40, starting over seemed impossible, especially when his entire familiar world was crumbling around him. So he fled to the wilderness, hoping to find in the village's quiet what he had lost in the city's hustle: peace, clarity of thought, perhaps even a meaning to life. The river became his refuge from these heavy reflections. Here, time flowed differently, measured and unhurried, like the water itself between the banks. Michael learned to distinguish the sounds of this place: the splash of a fish, the rustle of reeds, the creak of old planks under his weight, the distant call of a cuckoo in the forest on the other bank. Sometimes he brought a fishing rod and pretended to fish, but in reality he just enjoyed the solitude and the chance to not think about anything important. The fish here bit poorly. Locals said only small, strange fish lived in Willow Creek with cloudy eyes and an unpleasant taste of mud. In the evenings, as the sun began to set behind the forest, a fog would rise over the river. At first, these were light white streaks trailing over the water, but gradually the fog became denser until it enveloped everything in a milky haze. At such moments, Michael felt cut off from the rest of the world, as if he had entered some intermediate space between day and night, between reality and dream. Sounds became muffled, the outlines of trees blurred, and it seemed as if he was not in an ordinary place, but in some enchanted land where different laws applied. Anna Miller began to worry, seeing how often her new neighbor went to the river. She remembered that in her youth many men showed a strange interest in the crossing, especially those who were going through hard times. It was as if the river called them, promising a solution to all their problems on the other side. The old teacher tried several times to strike up a conversation with Michael about local peculiarities, hinting that it was better not to go to the river after sunset, but he brushed off her words, considering them ordinary village superstitions. The city man was used to trusting only what he could see and touch, and old legends seemed to him just a way for locals to entertain themselves on long winter evenings. The first time Michael saw the ferry was in late September, when the days became noticeably shorter, and frost appeared on the grass in the mornings. He sat on the dock, watching the sun slowly descend towards the horizon, painting the water in golden tones. The fog was just beginning to rise, creating whimsical patterns over the river's surface, when something dark flickered in the white mist. At first, Michael thought it was just a play of light and shadow, but then the outlines became clearer. A long, narrow boat emerged from the fog, and on its stern stood a figure in a dark cloak. The ferryman held a long pole and slowly guided his vessel along the bank as if looking for a place to moor. Michael's heart beat faster. He didn't expect to see another person on the river, especially at such a time and in such weather. The ferryman moved silently, and only the gentle lapping of water betrayed his presence. The boat was of an old design, wide and flat-bottomed, intended for transporting several passengers or a small cargo. Tall poles stuck out from the stern and bow, between which a rope was stretched, apparently for passengers to hold onto during the crossing. Everything looked as if this ferry had come from the last century, from a time when regular transport still plied Willow Creek. The ferryman noticed Michael and steered the boat towards the dock. As it approached, details became visible. A worn dark gray cloak with a hood obscuring his face, powerful hands clutching the pole, slow, measured movements of a man accustomed to hard physical labor. The boat gently nudged the old planks with its bow, and the ferryman extended his hand, inviting him aboard. The gesture was silent but understandable. The man offered to take him to the other side. Michael hesitated for a moment. He had no particular business on the other side, but curiosity got the better of him. He had long wanted to explore the forest on the opposite bank of the river, and here was a convenient opportunity. Stepping onto the ferry, Michael felt the heavy planks sway slightly under his weight. The boat was sturdily built, but clearly very old. The wood had darkened with time and dampness. Traces of repairs were visible in places, and the metal parts were covered with rust. He sat on the bench in the middle of the boat and tried to discern the ferryman's face, but the hood obscured his features. Only his hands were visible, surprisingly pale, almost white, with long, thin fingers. These hands moved with astonishing precision, guiding the pole into the right spots on the riverbed, pushing off from rocks and snags, steering the boat with a skill that comes only after many years of working on the water. The crossing took place in complete silence. The ferryman did not utter a word, nor did he respond to Michael's attempts to strike up a conversation. The fog grew thicker, and soon they were floating in a white cocoon where neither banks nor direction of travel could be seen. Time seemed to stop. Michael couldn't tell how many minutes they had been underway, 5 or 50. The water beneath the boat was black and still like oil, and nothing was reflected in it. Neither fog nor sky nor the ferryman's silhouette. Gradually, a strange stupor began to overcome Michael, as if his consciousness was slowly drifting into a slumber. When the fog lifted, the boat was already at the opposite bank. Michael shook himself, surprised at how quickly the crossing had passed, and thanked the ferryman. The ferryman silently nodded and extended his hand, helping him ashore. Only then did Michael realize he hadn't paid for the passage and reached for his wallet. But the ferryman shook his head and pushed the boat away from the bank. The fog thickened again, and within seconds the ferry disappeared into the white mist, leaving Michael alone on the unfamiliar bank. The forest was nothing like it appeared from afar. The trees stood too close together, their trunks covered with a strange moss that glowed with a dull greenish light in the twilight. The air was stale and damp, smelling of decaying leaves and something else, a sweet, cloying scent that caused slight nausea. There were no paths here, and Michael pushed through thickets of bushes, stumbling over roots and falling into hidden pits. Several times he thought he heard voices, distant, mournful, calling his name. But when he stopped and listened, there was only oppressive silence. Wandering through the forest, he noticed that there were no animals at all. No squirrels, no birds, not even insects. A complete dead silence that pressed on his ears and made his heart beat faster. The trees, too, were somehow wrong. Too tall, with twisted branches that intertwined, forming a dense canopy that barely let in any light. And their leaves did not turn yellow as they should in autumn, but remained dark green, yet somehow lifeless, as if made of wax. Time in this forest flowed strangely. Michael had been walking for several hours, but he felt no fatigue, and the sky above remained uniformly gray with no signs of approaching night or morning. Gradually, he began to realize he was lost. Every clearing looked like the last, every tree seemed familiar, yet he couldn't find his way back to the river. Panic crept in subtly. First a slight unease, then real fear. Michael quickened his pace, then ran, pushing through branches and bushes, but the forest seemed to deliberately confuse him, turning paths in unexpected directions and leading him into dead ends. When he finally reached the river, the sun had already set, and a thick fog swirled over the water. The ferry was in the same spot where it had dropped him off a few hours ago, and the ferryman waited patiently, leaning on his pole. Michael headed towards the boat with relief, but as he approached, the feeling of relief was replaced by a strange anxiety. Something was wrong. The ferryman stood in precisely the same pose as when he had left him, as if he hadn't moved at all that entire time. And the fog around the boat was somehow unnatural, too white, too dense. It didn't dissipate even with a light breeze blowing from the river. The return crossing passed in the same silence. But now Michael watched the ferryman carefully, trying to discern his face under the hood. Several times he thought he saw the outline of a nose or chin, but each time the shadows obscured the features again. The ferryman's hands were still surprisingly pale, but now Michael noticed that they showed no signs of sun exposure or calluses, which a person constantly working on the water should have. The skin was smooth and cold to the touch, almost transparent with dark veins showing through. When the boat reached the familiar bank, Michael again tried to pay for the passage, but the ferryman refused. Moreover, he made a gesture that could be understood as an invitation to return. As he walked up the path to his house, Michael turned back several times, but the ferry had already disappeared into the fog, as if it had dissolved into thin air. At home, an unpleasant surprise awaited him. The clock showed late night, though he thought he had been away for only a few hours. A plate with his cold dinner, which he had prepared before going to the river, sat on the kitchen table, and the first rays of dawn were already peeking through the window. The following days Michael spent in a strange state between wakefulness and sleep. He performed his usual chores around the house, went to the store, and talked to his neighbors, but his thoughts constantly returned to the river crossing. The forest on the other bank haunted his mind, its dead silence, strange trees, the feeling of something hidden and dangerous. And yet, he felt drawn to return there, to explore the places he hadn't managed to reach the first time. Perhaps there was some secret there, some clue to the restlessness that had plagued him since moving to the village. Anna Miller noticed the changes in her neighbor right away. Michael looked pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes as if he hadn't slept for several nights. When she tried to speak with him, he answered distractedly, constantly glancing towards the river. His movements had become slow, as if he were moving underwater, and his gaze took on a detached quality, as if he saw something inaccessible to others. The old teacher knew these signs. This was how people looked when the river began to call to them. She remembered her neighbor Ivan, who, after his wife's death, started going to the crossing every evening and eventually disappeared. She remembered the young widow Katerina, who lost her husband in the war and also vanished after one of her nightly trips to the water. Worry compelled Anna to break the unspoken rule of village life, not to meddle in neighbors' affairs without good reason. She came to Michael's house with a jar of jam and, under the guise of a friendly visit, tried to find out what was happening to him. The house greeted her with a musty smell and dim light. The curtains were drawn, no lights were on, and untouched food sat on the table. Michael was sitting in an armchair by the window, staring towards the river, oblivious to the near darkness in the room. When Anna switched on the light, he flinched and looked at her as if he didn't immediately recognize her. The conversation was difficult. Michael answered in monosyllables, often stopping mid-sentence, staring blankly. When asked about his health, he said he felt fine, but his hands trembled when he poured tea and his face was ashen. Anna cautiously asked if he had been going to the river, and she saw her neighbor's eyes gleam with a strange light. He began to talk about the crossing, about the forest on the other side, about the silence that reigned there, but he spoke disjointedly, jumping from one thought to another. The old teacher listened and felt a chill creep into her heart. She knew that Michael was already halfway claimed by the river, and stopping the process would be very difficult. As she left, she tried to warn him of the danger, telling him about her sister Sarah and others who had disappeared after encountering the ferryman. But Michael listened as if she were telling a children's fairy tale. To him, the ferryman was just a local man who made extra money transporting people across the river. And the forest on the other side was just an ordinary forest where one could get lost if they didn't know the paths. His urban rationalism protected him from superstitions, but at the same time, it made him vulnerable to the power that lurked in the dark waters of Willow Creek. That very night, Michael went to the crossing again. He couldn't explain what drew him there, but resisting the urge became increasingly difficult. The day passed in tormenting anticipation of sunset, and as the sun began to sink behind the trees, he felt something in his chest pull him towards the water. The ferry waited for him in the same spot, as if the ferryman knew of his arrival beforehand. This time, Michael looked more closely at the boat and noticed strange details that had escaped his attention the first time. The planks weren't just old. They were covered with symbols carved or burned into the wood. The signs were unclear, partly erased by time, but they felt ancient and frightening. The crossing was silent again, but this time Michael tried to engage the ferryman in conversation, asking his name, wondering how long he had worked on the river. There was no answer. The man in the dark cloak moved slowly and deliberately, as if he didn't hear the words addressed to him. Only once did he turn his head towards the passenger, and Michael saw two glowing spots deep within the hood, eyes that burned with a cold, lifeless light. A shiver ran down his spine from that gaze, but the ferryman immediately turned away, continuing to steer the boat. The forest on the other side greeted him with the same dead silence. But now Michael walked purposefully, as if he knew where to go. A path which hadn't been there before wound between the trees, leading deeper into the thicket. Strange flowers grew along the edges, pale, almost transparent, scentless, glowing with an ethereal luminescence in the twilight. The air became increasingly stale, smelling of grave dampness and something else. A sweet, decaying aroma that permeated his lungs and caused fits of nausea. But Michael walked on, compelled by a force he couldn't understand or resist. Soon the path led him to a clearing, in the center of which stood an old house. It was a wooden structure without windows, with a sagging roof and a boarded-up door. The same ghostly flowers grew around the house, forming perfect circles, as if someone had specifically planted them. Michael approached closer and saw that the house's planks were covered with the same symbols as the ferry. ancient signs whose meaning had been lost to time. A dim greenish light seeped from the cracks between the planks, and the structure itself exuded a feeling of something alive, yet not human. He walked around the perimeter of the house trying to find a way inside, but all the windows and doors were tightly boarded up. However, on the back wall he discovered a narrow crack wide enough to peer through. Bringing his face close to the opening, Michael saw an empty room inside, lit by the same spectral light. In the center of the room stood an old table, and on it lay an open book. The pages of the book turned on their own, as if an invisible reader were flipping them, and the text glowed in the darkness as if written in phosphorus. The air inside the house shimmered, creating the sensation that someone else was there, someone invisible and intangible. Suddenly, the book slammed shut, and a sound came from the house. A quiet, drawn-out sound like a moan or a sob. Michael recoiled from the crack and felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. A silence hung in the air, so thick and oppressive that it felt as if one could touch it. Even the ghostly flowers stopped glowing, plunging the clearing into utter darkness. And in that darkness something moved, slowly, cautiously, approaching where Michael stood. He turned and ran, blindly crashing through branches and bushes, stumbling over roots. Behind him he heard sounds of pursuit, not footsteps but something else gliding, as if a huge snake were crawling on the ground. The forest around him came alive with a malicious, predatory anticipation. Trees bent, trying to hold back the fugitive with their branches, and roots protruded from the ground, ready to trip and bring him down. Michael ran without looking back until he reached the river, where the ferry with the motionless figure of the ferryman still awaited him. The return crossing passed in a nightmarish semi-consciousness. Michael sat on the bench, breathing heavily and trying to calm his wildly pounding heart, while the ferryman slowly guided the boat through the fog. Several times he thought he heard voices, many voices calling his name, asking him to stay, promising peace and oblivion. The voices were sad and mournful, full of hopeless longing, and in each of them he recognized the inflections of people he had known in life. There was his mother, who died 5 years ago, his grandfather, who died in the war long before his birth, school friends with whom he had lost touch years ago. When the ferry docked at the familiar bank, Michael hurriedly jumped out of the boat and rushed up the path, not looking back. At home, he locked all the doors, drew the curtains, and sat in an armchair, trembling with fear and incomprehension. The clock showed 3 in the morning, but he couldn't sleep. The image of the old house in the forest stood before his eyes, the voices of the dead echoed in his ears, and the glowing eyes beneath the ferryman's hood resurfaced in his memory. All of this didn't fit into the framework of his ordinary world, contradicting everything he believed, but denying the reality of what was happening became increasingly difficult. In the morning, he tried to find a rational explanation for what he had experienced. Perhaps there were poisonous plants in the forest that caused hallucinations. Perhaps the ferryman was just a local eccentric who liked to scare newcomers with his silence and strange appearance. Perhaps the house in the forest was an abandoned shack where a hermit once lived, and all these light effects were explained by phosphorescent fungi or bacteria. Michael clung to these explanations like a drowning man to a straw, but deep down, he knew they wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. For several days, he tried not to think about the river, occupying himself with housework, reading books, even attempting to fix his internet connection to distract himself with movies. But the desire to return to the crossing did not wane. It only intensified with each passing hour. It was like a physical pain, sharp, pulsating, giving him no peace day or night. By the evening of the 3rd day, resisting became impossible. Michael understood that he was being swayed by some external force, but the willpower needed to stay home was beyond his capabilities. The ferryman waited for him, as always. But now Michael noticed that the boat looked different. The planks had darkened even more, the symbols on them became clearer and brighter, and the structure itself seemed to have changed, becoming more archaic, like the ancient boats used to carry the deceased to their final resting place. The water around the ferry had also changed. It had become completely black, opaque, and nothing was reflected in it, not even the moon, which hung as a bright disk in the sky. This time the crossing lasted longer than usual. The fog was so thick that Michael couldn't even see his own hands stretched out in front of him. Time lost all meaning. It seemed they had been sailing for many hours, perhaps many days. The ferryman remained silent, but now a cold emanation emanated from him, penetrating his clothes and reaching his bones. Michael tried to stand up and approach the figure in the cloak, but found he couldn't move. His body felt glued to the bench, and his muscles wouldn't obey his brain's commands. The forest on the other side greeted him, transformed. The trees were taller and denser, their branches intertwined overhead, forming a solid canopy through which no ray of light could penetrate. The ghostly flowers glowed brighter, creating bizarre patterns on the ground, and strange sounds hung in the air. Whispers, moans, distant music that sometimes approached, sometimes receded. The path led him to the same spot where the mysterious house stood. But now the structure looked completely different. The planks were black as coal, the roof had collapsed in several places, and tongues of the same greenish light burst from the cracks between the logs. The house door was wide open, and voices came from within, the very voices he had heard during previous crossings. Now they were not just calling his name, but uttering complete phrases, speaking of the peace that awaited him inside, of how good it would be to forget all problems and sufferings, to dissolve into eternal silence. Michael took a step towards the door, then another. His legs moved on their own as if someone else were controlling his body. His mind screamed, demanding him to stop, to run, to save himself, but his body disobeyed, slowly and inevitably approaching the black doorway. At the last moment, something made Michael stop. Perhaps it was an instinct for self-preservation, or perhaps his mother's voice, which had once taught him not to enter strangers' homes uninvited. He froze at the threshold, fighting the force that pulled him inward, and in that struggle he unexpectedly regained control over his own body. Turning around, he bolted from the house, pushing through the thickets back towards the river. Behind him he heard sounds of disappointment, moans, cries, curses in an unknown language. But he didn't look back, understanding that this was his last chance at salvation. The ferry waited by the bank, but the ferryman now looked different. His cloak billowed, though there was no wind, and a faint reddish glow emanated from beneath his hood. As Michael approached the boat, the ferryman spoke for the first time. His voice was like the whisper of autumn leaves, the creak of old wood in the wind, the last breath of a dying person. He spoke in the same unknown language as the voices from the house, but the meaning of the words somehow reached Michael's consciousness. The ferryman asked why he hadn't entered the house, why he had refused the peace that awaited him there. Why did he cling to a life full of pain and disappointments when he could find eternal oblivion? Michael didn't answer, silently got into the boat and closed his eyes, trying not to listen to the ferryman's lulling voice. The crossing this time was agonizingly long. The fog became so thick that it was hard to breathe, and hands rose from the water, pale, ghostly, reaching for the boat. These hands belonged to those who had already crossed the river and remained on the other side forever. They clawed at the sides of the ferry, tried to climb inside, whispering words of temptation and threat. Michael saw among them the faces of familiar people, neighbors from his city apartment, colleagues from work, even his ex-wife Helen. All of them were deathly pale, with empty eye sockets instead of eyes, and all pleaded to be taken along, not to be left in the cold water. When the ferry finally docked at the familiar bank, Michael scrambled out of the boat and ran home without looking back. But even there, behind locked doors and drawn curtains, he didn't feel safe. The house filled with strange sounds, floorboards creaking when no one was walking on them, thuds against the walls from inside, whispers of voices coming from empty rooms. Unfamiliar reflections flickered in the mirrors. Books opened by themselves to pages covered with the same ancient symbols as on the ferry, and black liquid smelling of mud and decay flowed from the taps instead of water. Michael realized that the river wouldn't release him easily. He had become its prisoner from the moment he first stepped onto the ferryman's boat, and now he could only choose to go willingly or be taken by force. Sleep completely abandoned him. Food became tasteless and unnecessary, and the mirror showed not his face but that of a stranger with deathly pale skin and sunken eyes. He lost weight, growing weaker with each passing day, and soon realized he was slowly dying, withering like a tree cut off from water. In these days of despair, Anna Miller came to him again. The old teacher was horrified to see what her neighbor had become. Michael sat in the darkened room, barely reacting to her presence, muttering something under his breath. Coming closer, she heard him repeating the same phrase. "The river calls, the river waits, it's time to go home." Anna tried to shake him to make him look at her, but he stared through her, as if seeing something else. Perhaps that very house in the forest on the other side, perhaps the ferryman himself standing in the corner of the room. She told him a story she had never told anyone before. The story of how her sister Sarah tried to return. It happened a month after the girl's disappearance. Anna, then still a child, woke up in the middle of the night to a knock at the window. Sarah stood outside the glass, but she was no longer the cheerful girl who had gone to the crossing. Her skin was white as snow, her hair wet as if she had just emerged from the water, and her eyes burned with the same cold light as the ferryman's. Sarah begged to open the window, pleaded to be let into the house, promised that everything would be as it was before. But Anna's mother was a wise woman. She knew this was not her daughter, but something else that had taken her form. All night, the dead Sarah stood under the window, knocking on the glass, begging, threatening. But she was not let into the house. At dawn, she disappeared and never returned. Michael listened to this story and laughed, quietly, madly, as people who have lost their minds laugh. He said that Anna didn't understand the main thing. The dead were happier than the living because they had no pain, no fears, no disappointments. There, on the other side, in the house among the ghostly flowers, one could find oblivion dissolve into eternal silence, become part of something greater and silent. This was not death in the usual sense. It was liberation from the burden of existence. And the old teacher realized she was too late. The river had already claimed her neighbor's soul, leaving only a dying husk that would soon follow. That same night, Anna Miller did not sleep, sitting by the window and watching Michael's house. Around midnight, she saw him emerge from the house and slowly, like a sleepwalker, head towards the path leading to the river. The old woman wanted to shout, to stop him, but she knew it was futile. She could only watch the man who was walking to his last encounter with the ferryman of the dead. The ferry awaited Michael in the same spot, but now it looked completely different. The boat was larger, its sides rose higher, and figures appeared on the bow and stern, carved images of grieving women with veiled faces. The ferry's planks were no longer black. They glowed from within with the same spectral light as the flowers in the forest, and the ancient symbols burned like molten iron. The ferryman stood at the stern, and now his face was visible beneath the hood. It was the face of a very old man, but not frail with age, rather parched by time, as if carved from yellow stone. His eyes burned with red fire, and his mouth was open in a silent smile, revealing teeth sharp as a predator's. Michael sat in the boat and felt a strange relief. The pain that had tormented him for the past few days vanished. Anxieties and fears dissolved as if they had never existed. He realized that he was finally going home, to where all those who had gone before him awaited. The crossing passed quickly. The fog parted, revealing the way, and the water beneath the boat became transparent as glass. At the bottom, he saw the faces of those who had failed to reach the shore, people who had tried to swim the river on their own and drowned in its cold waters. They lay at the bottom, their eyes open, looking up, and their lips seemed to move, uttering silent words of forgiveness or curse. The forest on the other side greeted him like an old friend. The trees parted, forming a wide path. Ghostly flowers showered him with petals, and a quiet, mournful music played in the air. Perhaps it was the wind singing in the leaves, or perhaps the souls of those who had already found peace here. The house stood in its familiar place, but now it was not frightening, but welcoming. Windows glowed with a warm yellow light. The door was wide open, and familiar figures stood on the threshold. His mother, his grandfather, school friends, all those he had lost over the years of his life. They greeted him with joy, embraced him, and led him inside the house. The rooms were full of people, men and women of all ages, children and elders, all of whom had once crossed the river on the ferryman's boat and remained here forever. They told each other stories of their lives, shared memories, and there was no sorrow in their voices, only a calm acceptance of their fate. Michael found Sarah, Anna Miller's sister, among them. She was as young and beautiful as on the day of her disappearance, only her eyes burned with the same cold light as everyone else's. Sarah told him the truth about this place. The house was a waypoint for souls who could not find peace in the world of the living. The ferrymen collected those who had lost connection with life, who no longer felt joy in waking to each new day, who only dreamed of all suffering ending. Here in the house among the ghostly forest, they could find oblivion, dissolve into eternal silence, become part of something larger and silent. This was not death in the usual sense. It was liberation from the burden of existence. Michael listened to her words and felt the last ties to his former life sever one by one. His house in the village, the job he lost, the wife who left him, the future plans he never truly had. All of it now seemed unimportant, alien, as if it belonged to someone else. He sat in an armchair by the fireplace where a fire burned without wood, giving light without warmth, and waited. Sarah explained that the transition process takes time. One must wait until the last memories of the living world disappear from memory, until the soul is freed from all earthly attachments. Time in the house flowed differently. Michael couldn't say how many days, weeks, or months had passed since his arrival. He interacted with the other inhabitants of the house, listened to their stories, gradually forgetting his own. The names of loved ones faded from memory. Faces became blurry. Events of his past life lost clarity, as if obscured by fog. And with each passing day, he became calmer, more indifferent to what happened beyond the house's walls, but complete oblivion never came. Somewhere deep within his consciousness remained a tiny spark, a memory of something important that he shouldn't have lost. It could have been his mother's face leaning over his childhood bed, or the laughter of a school friend, or even just the feeling of a sunbeam on his skin on a summer day. This spark prevented him from completely dissolving into the general mass of oblivion, and gradually he understood that he would remain in the house forever, but would never achieve the peace that was promised to him. And in the town of Stonehaven, life went on. Anna Miller waited for Michael's return for a long time, though she knew he would never come back. His house stood empty, its windows boarded up, and weeds grew in the garden, gradually obscuring traces of human presence. Neighbors sometimes said they saw lights in the windows of the abandoned house, heard voices coming from empty rooms, but the old teacher knew that these were just echoes of the past, shadows of memories that would still wander for a while where a man once lived. The river still flowed between its banks, hidden by fog and thickets of willow. The ferryman continued his eternal work, appearing every evening at the old dock and awaiting new passengers. For there will always be people who are tired of life, who have lost hope for happiness, who only dream of peace. And the river will call to them, promising a solution to all problems on the other side, in the forest where ghostly flowers grow and stands a house full of forgotten souls. Anna Miller lived for several more years, preserving the memory of her sister Sarah and her neighbor Michael. Before her death, she wrote their story in an old notebook, hoping that someone would read it and know about the danger that lurked in the dark waters of Willow Creek. But the notebook was lost among other papers. The old teacher's house was sold to city dwellers who didn't believe in local legends, and the story of the ferryman of the dead became just another tale told to children before bedtime. and only the river remembers. Every evening as the sun sets beyond the horizon and the fog rises over the water, the silhouette of the ferry can be seen with a motionless figure at the stern. The ferryman awaits new passengers, those who are ready to exchange the pain of life for eternal oblivion. For among the living there will always be those who are tired of fighting, who have lost their last hope for happiness. And then the dark water will close over their heads, carrying them to a place from which there is no return. To a world where time has stopped forever and souls wander in eternal twilight between life and death, belonging to neither world. This is how the story of the ferryman of Willow Creek ends, not with the triumph of good over evil nor the salvation of a lost soul, but with the tragic understanding that some paths lead only one way and some choices cannot be undone. Michael sought peace and found it, but the price of that peace was too high. His own soul forever confined in the house of forgotten dreams among the ghosts of those who once also believed that happiness awaited them on the other side.